The first snowflakes of winter were falling on the mountains when Claire received the message that would change her life forever. She stood in the great hall of the mansion holding a letter with trembling hands. Her two dragons, Ember and Frost, sensed her distress and moved closer to her. The red dragon pressed his warm scales against her left side, while the white dragon offered cool comfort on her right. Claire read the words again, hoping she had misunderstood. But the meaning remained clear. Richard the Merchant Lord was dying. She had known this day would come eventually. Humans lived such short lives compared to elves. But Richard had been more than just an employer to Claire. He had been her savior and her friend. 14 years ago, when she was barely more than a child by elven standards, she had been attacked by bandits in the forest. They had left her bleeding and broken beneath an old oak tree. Richard had found her during one of his trading journeys. Instead of leaving her to die as most humans would have done, he brought her to his home and paid for healers to save her life. Claire ran through the corridors of the mansion, her footsteps echoing on the marble floors. Servants moved aside quickly when they saw her coming. They all knew where she was going and why. The master's bedroom was on the top floor in a room that overlooked the gardens Richard loved so much. Two guards stood outside the door, but they stepped aside immediately when they saw Claire approaching. They knew she had more right to be there than anyone except family. The room was dim, with curtains drawn against the afternoon light. Richard lay in his bed looking smaller and frailer than Claire had ever seen him. His son Lucas sat beside the bed holding his father's hand. The young man looked up when Claire entered, and she could see tears in his eyes. Lucas was only 16 years old, barely old enough to inherit the massive fortune his father had built over a lifetime of trading and business. Claire moved to the other side of the bed and knelt down. Richard's eyes opened slowly, and when he saw her, he smiled weakly. That smile reminded her of the day he had found her in the forest. Even near death, he still had kindness in his eyes. He gestured for her to come closer, and she leaned in to hear his whispered words. Richard spoke slowly, his voice barely audible above his labored breathing. He told Claire that he knew his time was ending. He told her that Lucas would need to leave soon to complete his education at the Imperial Academy, far across the sea. The journey would take months and the studies would take years, but it was necessary for Lucas to learn everything he needed to know to manage the fortune and the business empire his father had built. Then Richard asked Claire something that shocked her to her core. He asked her to guard his fortune until Lucas returned. He asked her to protect everything he had built from those who would try to steal it. He asked her to make an oath that she would not leave or abandon her duty no matter how long it took. For elves, an oath was sacred. It was a bond that could not be broken without bringing shame and dishonor to the one who made it. Claire looked into Richard's eyes and saw the desperation there. She looked at young Lucas, who was watching her with hope and fear mixed together on his face. She thought about the life Richard had given her when he saved her in the forest. She thought about the years she had spent in this house learning human customs and finding a place where she belonged, even though she was so different from everyone around her. She made the oath. Richard died 3 days later with his son beside him and Claire standing guard at the door. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people. Merchants and nobles came from across the kingdom to pay their respects to a man who had been fair and honest in all his dealings. Claire stood in the back of the ceremony with Ember and Frost beside her. She watched as Lucas tried to be strong while saying goodbye to his father. After the funeral, the vultures began to circle. The first ones came politely. They were officials from the kingdom's treasury. They wore fine clothes and carried documents with royal seals. They explained to Claire that since Lucas was still a minor and would be leaving for his studies, the estate should be placed under government management. It was just a formality, they said, just to make sure everything was properly maintained until the young master returned. Claire refused. The officials became less polite. They raised their voices and threatened legal action. They said that an elf had no authority to make decisions about a human estate. They said she was just a servant and should know her place. Claire remained calm, but Ember did not. The red dragon moved forward and breathed a small stream of flame that scorched the floor at the official's feet. Smoke rose from Ember's nostrils, and his eyes glowed like hot coals. The officials left quickly. Lucas departed for the Imperial Academy 1 week after his father's funeral. Claire stood at the gates of the mansion and watched the carriage carry him away. The young man looked back through the window and raised his hand in farewell. Claire raised hers in return. She wondered if she would ever see him again. The journey to the academy was dangerous, and the seas were full of pirates and storms. But she pushed those thoughts aside. Lucas was strong like his father, and he had good guards with him. After Lucas left, the mansion became very quiet. Most of the servants were dismissed because there was no need for so many people to maintain a house with only one resident. Claire kept only the groundskeeper and the cook. She spent her days walking through the empty halls and her nights studying the documents that detailed every part of Richard's fortune. There were properties in 12 different cities. There were ships that carried goods across 3 seas. There were warehouses full of silk and spices and precious metals. There were vaults containing gold and jewels worth more than most kingdoms possessed. Claire understood now why Richard had asked her to make the oath. This fortune could buy armies. It could topple governments. It could make whoever controlled it one of the most powerful people in the world. And there would be many who would do anything to claim it. The second wave of claimants arrived 2 months after Lucas departed. These were relatives of Richard, cousins and nephews and distant family members who Claire had never seen during all her years in the house. They came with lawyers and genealogy charts proving their blood connection to Richard. They argued that since Lucas was gone and might never return, the fortune should pass to the closest living relatives. Claire met them in the great hall. She stood before them in her elven armor with her dragons flanking her on both sides. She told them that Lucas would return, and when he did, his inheritance would be waiting for him. The relatives argued and threatened. One of them even tried to push past her to enter the vault room. Frost moved with lightning speed and breathed a stream of freezing air that turned the man's clothes stiff with ice. He stumbled backward, gasping and shivering. The relatives left, but Claire knew they would return. They would bring soldiers next time. They would try to take by force what they could not claim by law. She spent the evening reinforcing the mansion's defenses. She set magical wards on all the doors and windows. She trained Ember and Frost in combat formations. She sharpened her own weapons and prepared herself for the battles that were surely coming. That night, Claire stood on the balcony of the master bedroom and looked out over the gardens. The mountains rose in the distance, dark against the starlit sky. She thought about her oath and the long years that stretched ahead of her. She wondered if Lucas would remember her when he finally returned. She wondered if she would even recognize him after so many years had passed. But none of that mattered now. She had made a promise to a dying man. She would keep that promise no matter what came. The soldiers came on a cold morning 3 months after the relatives had been turned away. Claire was in the training yard with her dragons when she heard the sound of marching boots on the mountain road. She climbed to the top of the mansion's highest tower and looked down at the approaching force. There were at least 200 men wearing the colors of Richard's distant cousin, a minor noble named Gregory, who claimed to be the rightful heir to the fortune. Claire felt her heart sink as she counted the soldiers and saw the siege, weapons they were dragging behind them. Gregory had brought catapults and battering rams. He was not here to negotiate or argue legal points. He was here to take the mansion by force and claim everything inside it. She watched as the army formed ranks in front of the main gates. A man on horseback rode forward carrying a white flag of parley. Claire descended from the tower and walked to the gates with Ember and Frost beside her. She did not open the gates but spoke to the messenger through the iron bars. The man was young and nervous. His eyes kept darting to the dragons who were watching him with predatory interest. He cleared his throat and read from a scroll in a shaking voice. The message was simple and direct. Gregory claimed that Lucas had died during the journey to the Imperial Academy. A storm had sunk the ship carrying him and all aboard had perished. Since Lucas was dead, the fortune now belonged to Gregory as the next living relative. Claire had 1 hour to open the gates and surrender the estate peacefully. If she refused, Gregory would take it by force and she would be arrested for theft and obstruction. Claire felt cold fury rising in her chest. She knew the message was a lie. She had received a letter from Lucas only 2 weeks ago. The young man had arrived safely at the academy and had begun his studies. He wrote about his professors and his new friends. He wrote about the strange foods and customs of the imperial capital. He even wrote about missing home and hoping that Claire was well. She told the messenger that Lucas was alive and that Gregory was a liar. She told him to return to his master and tell him that the oath she made to Richard still stood. She would not surrender the mansion or the fortune to anyone except Lucas himself. The messenger looked relieved to be dismissed. He rode back to the army quickly, eager to be away from the dragons and their fierce guardian. Gregory did not wait the full hour. 30 minutes after the messenger returned, the attack began. The catapults launched their first volley of stones at the mansion's walls, but the walls had been built by the best craftsmen in the kingdom and reinforced with magical wards. The stones bounced off, leaving barely a scratch. The soldiers charged forward with battering rams aimed at the main gates. Claire gave Ember the signal. The red dragon leaped into the air with powerful beats of his wings. He circled overhead, then dove toward the catapults, breathing a stream of fire that melted the wooden frames and turned the ammunition into molten slag. The soldiers operating the siege weapons scattered in panic as Ember made another pass, setting 3 more catapults ablaze. Meanwhile, Frost dealt with the battering rams. The white dragon stood on top of the gatehouse and breathed her freezing breath downward. The air itself seemed to crystallize as the temperature dropped far below zero. The soldiers carrying the rams found their hands frozen to the wooden beams. Their armor became so cold it burned their skin. They dropped the rams and ran stumbling away from the gates while their commanders shouted orders that no one followed. The battle was over in less than 20 minutes. Gregory's soldiers were not trained to fight dragons. They were common men who had been promised easy money for what should have been a simple occupation of an undefended mansion. They had not been told they would face an elven warrior and 2 fully grown dragons. The army broke apart and fled down the mountain road, leaving their weapons and their wounded behind. Claire watched them go from the gatehouse. She felt no satisfaction in the victory. She knew this was only the beginning. Word would spread about what had happened here. Some people would be deterred by the news that the mansion was defended by dragons, but others would see it as a challenge. Worse still, Gregory would not give up so easily. He would return with more soldiers, or he would hire mercenaries who specialized in fighting magical creatures. That night, Claire walked through the mansion, checking every ward and defensive spell. She found evidence that someone had tried to tamper with the magical protections during the battle. Scratch marks on the wall showed where someone had attempted to carve counterspells. It had been a distraction. While she was focused on the soldiers and siege weapons, someone else had tried to slip inside and disable the defenses. She realized she needed help. 1 elf and 2 dragons could defend against direct assault, but they could not be everywhere at once. The mansion was too large, with too many entrances and too many places where a skilled thief could slip inside. She needed eyes and ears beyond what she and her dragons could provide. Claire spent the next week setting up a new defense system. She hired a network of informants in the nearby town. These were ordinary people who owed debts to Richard and were loyal to his memory. They would watch for strangers asking questions about the mansion. They would listen for rumors of new attacks being planned. They would send word to Claire if anyone suspicious came to town. She also made arrangements with a group of traveling merchants who had done business with Richard for many years. These merchants moved between cities and heard all kinds of news and gossip. They agreed to keep Claire informed of anything they learned about plots against the mansion or false claims being made about Lucas's death. The information network proved valuable almost immediately. Within 2 weeks, Claire learned that Gregory was hiring a company of mercenaries, known for their skill in breaking sieges. She also learned that several other relatives were pooling their resources to fund their own attempt to claim the fortune. There were rumors of assassins being hired and magical artifacts being purchased on the black market. Claire realized she was facing not one enemy, but many. Every greedy relative and ambitious noble saw Richard's fortune as their ticket to power and wealth. They would keep coming in waves, each attack more sophisticated than the last. She could not fight them all forever. Eventually, she would make a mistake, or the dragons would be wounded, or the defenses would fail. But giving up was not an option. She had made an oath. More than that, she owed Richard a debt that could never be fully repaid. He had saved her life when he had no reason to do so. He had treated her with kindness and respect in a world where most humans saw elves as inferior or dangerous. She would honor his memory by protecting what he had built. The next attack came from an unexpected direction. A group of men arrived at the mansion gates claiming to be representatives from the Imperial Academy. They said they had urgent news about Lucas and needed to speak with whoever was managing the estate. Claire was immediately suspicious, but she could not simply turn away official messengers from the academy, where Lucas was studying. She met with them in the Great Hall, keeping Ember and Frost close beside her. The men wore the right uniforms and carried documents that looked authentic. They said that Lucas had been expelled from the academy for failing his studies. According to their records, he had fallen in with a bad crowd and spent his time gambling and drinking instead of attending classes. The academy had sent him away in disgrace, and he had disappeared into the slums of the capital city. Claire knew instantly that it was all lies. Lucas's letters had been full of enthusiasm for his studies. He had written about his professors with respect and admiration. He had described the complex subjects he was learning with genuine interest. There was no way the diligent young man she knew had suddenly become a worthless drunk. She called the men on their deception. She produced Lucas's most recent letter and pointed out the date, which was more recent than the supposed expulsion. The fake officials tried to argue that the letter must be a forgery, but their story was falling apart. Claire signaled to Frost, and the white dragon moved forward with ice forming on her fangs. The men confessed quickly. They had been hired by a coalition of Richard's relatives to convince Claire that Lucas was unworthy of his inheritance. If she believed Lucas had failed the academy, she might be willing to hand over management of the fortune to someone more responsible. It was a clever plan, but it had failed because Claire knew Lucas better than his own relatives did. She let the men go with a warning. She told them to carry a message back to whoever had hired them. Lucas would return someday, and when he did, every person who had tried to steal his inheritance would answer for their crimes. Until then, she would stand guard, and no force in the world would move her from her post. The 14th winter came with unusual ferocity. Snow fell in heavy curtains across the mountains, making the roads impassable for weeks at a time. Claire stood at the window of the Great Hall, watching the storm and feeling a strange restlessness in her heart. Something was changing. She could feel it in the air the way elves sometimes sensed important events before they happened. Ember and Frost felt it too. The dragons were more alert than usual, constantly scanning the horizon, as if waiting for something to appear. Claire tried to focus on her daily routines, but she found herself distracted and anxious in a way she had not been for years. Then one morning, the storm broke. Sunlight poured across the snow-covered landscape, turning everything into a brilliant sea of white. Claire was in the library reviewing accounts when one of her informants from town arrived with urgent news. A message had come through the courier service. Lucas would be returning home within the week. Claire felt her heart leap and then immediately sink. 14 years of waiting were finally ending, but she was not ready. She looked around the mansion and saw it through fresh eyes. The halls were clean but empty. The furniture was maintained but covered in dust cloths. The gardens were dormant under snow. It looked like a tomb, not a home. She spent the next 3 days in a frenzy of preparation. She hired back some of the old servants and put them to work, cleaning every room and polishing every surface. She had the gardeners clear paths through the snow and prepare the fountains to be turned on when the weather warmed. She went through Richard's study and organized all the documents Lucas would need to understand his inheritance. But no amount of preparation could calm the anxiety Claire felt. She kept imagining different versions of Lucas returning. In some versions, he was angry that she had driven away so many of his relatives and potential allies. In other versions, he was cold and distant, seeing her as just a servant who had outlived her usefulness. In the worst versions, he did not remember her at all or thought she had been exaggerating the threats to the fortune. On the morning of the 7th day, Claire dressed in her formal armor for the first time in years. The silver and green metal still fit perfectly, though it felt strange after spending so long in practical clothing. She braided her hair in the traditional style of elven warriors. She polished her sword until it gleamed. If this was to be her last day as guardian of the fortune, she would meet it with dignity and honor. Ember and Frost positioned themselves on either side of the main entrance, their scales gleaming in the winter sunlight. Claire stood between them, watching the road that wound down from the mountain pass. She had sent away all the servants so she could greet Lucas privately. Whatever happened next would determine not just her future, but the future of everything Richard had built. The carriage appeared just after midday. It was larger than Claire expected, pulled by 6 horses instead of the usual 2. As it drew closer, she could see that it was well made, with the crest of the Imperial Academy painted on the door. Her heart began to pound as the carriage rolled through the gates and came to a stop in the courtyard. For a long moment, nothing happened. Claire stood frozen, unable to move or speak. Then the carriage door opened and a young man stepped out. No, not a young man anymore. Lucas was 29 years old now, a fully grown adult. He was tall like his father, with broad shoulders, and the confident bearing of someone who had seen the world and learned its ways. But it was his eyes that made Claire catch her breath. They were kind eyes full of intelligence and warmth. They were Richard's eyes. Lucas looked at her and smiled, then did something that shocked Claire to her core. He bowed. Not the casual nod of a master acknowledging a servant, but a deep formal bow of respect. The bow of one warrior honoring another. Claire felt 14 years of tension drain out of her body. She bowed back, her eyes stinging with tears she refused to let fall. When she straightened, Lucas was walking toward her with his hand extended. She took it and felt the strength in his grip. He was no longer the uncertain boy who had left all those years ago. He had become a man who knew his own worth. Lucas spoke, and his voice was deeper than Claire remembered, but still gentle. He thanked her for keeping her oath. He said his father had told him before the end that if he ever returned, it would be because Claire had protected what was his. He said he could never repay that debt, but he would spend the rest of his life trying. Claire tried to respond, but found she could not speak past the lump in her throat. Instead, she gestured toward the mansion, indicating that he should enter his home. But Lucas shook his head. He turned back to the carriage and opened the door wider. To Claire's amazement, 5 elves climbed out. They were dressed in traveling clothes, and they looked tired from their long journey. But they were smiling as they looked at her. Lucas explained that during his time at the Imperial Academy, he had not just studied human subjects. He had also spent time in the elven kingdoms learning their languages and customs. He had told them about Claire, about the lone guardian who had kept an oath for 14 years. The elves had been moved by the story. Some of them knew Claire's family. They had wanted to meet the warrior who had sacrificed so much for honor. One of the elves stepped forward. Her name was Dawn, and she had kind eyes that reminded Claire of her mother. Dawn said that the elven communities had thought Claire was lost or dead. No one had heard from her in so many years. The forests had mourned her absence, but now they knew the truth. Claire had not abandoned her people. She had been keeping an oath, and that made her a hero, not a deserter. Claire felt tears streaming down her face now, and she did not try to stop them. For 14 years she had believed she was alone. She had thought her people had forgotten her or rejected her for living among humans. But she had been wrong. They had been waiting for her just as she had been waiting for Lucas. Dawn embraced Claire, and the other elves gathered around them. They spoke in the elvish language, using words and phrases Claire had not heard in over a decade. They told her stories of what had happened in the forest during her absence. They brought greetings from her sisters and cousins. They made her feel connected to her people again in a way she had thought was lost forever. Lucas watched the reunion with satisfaction. When the elves finally stepped back, he approached Claire again. He said he had a proposal for her. The oath she made to his father was fulfilled. The fortune was safe and Lucas was home. Claire was free to return to her people if she wished. But Lucas hoped she would consider staying not as a guardian anymore, but as a friend and partner. He explained that he had spent 14 years preparing for this moment. He had learned everything he could about trade and diplomacy and management. But he had also learned that the world was changing. Humans and elves had lived separate lives for too long. There were opportunities for cooperation and mutual benefit that no one had explored because of old prejudices and misunderstandings. Lucas wanted to build something new. A trading company that would bridge the gap between human and elven worlds. A place where both peoples could work together as equals. It would be difficult and many would oppose it. But Lucas believed it could succeed if he had the right people beside him. People like Claire who had already proven they could be trusted with. Matters of great importance, Claire. Listened to Lucas's vision and felt something stirring in her heart that she had not felt in years. Hope. For so long she had focused only on duty and obligation. She had locked away her own dreams and desires. But now Lucas was offering her something she had never imagined. A chance to be part of something bigger than just guarding treasure. A chance to help build bridges between two worlds. A chance to matter in a way that went beyond keeping an oath. She looked at Dawn and the other elves who were watching her with encouraging smiles. She looked at Ember and Frost, who had been her only companions for so many years. She looked at Lucas, who was waiting patiently for her answer. And she realized that her long vigil had not been for nothing. Everything she had endured had led to this moment. All the loneliness and sacrifice had meaning, because it had brought together the people who stood in this courtyard right now. Claire smiled for the first time in years. She told Lucas she would stay, not because of duty or obligation, but because she wanted to. Because she believed in his vision. Because after 14 years of living in the past, it was finally time to start building a future. Years passed slowly in the mountains, and Claire felt the weight of time in a way she never had before. Elves could live for centuries, but they were not meant to spend those centuries alone. She missed her people more with each passing season. She missed the singing that filled the elven forests at dawn. She missed the festivals and celebrations that marked the changing of the seasons. She missed having someone to talk to who understood what it meant to be an elf in a world dominated by humans. But she could not leave. The oath she had made bound her to this place and this duty. So she adapted to her solitary life as best she could. She read books from Richard's extensive library, learning about human history and philosophy. She practiced her combat skills in the training yard, pushing herself to become faster and stronger. She spent hours with Ember and Frost, teaching them new tricks and deepening the bond between them. The dragons grew larger as the years went by. Ember was now the size of a small house, his red scales gleaming like polished rubies in the sunlight. Frost had grown equally impressive, her white scales shimmering with an inner light that made her look like a creature carved from ice and starlight. Together they were a formidable force that kept most threats at bay. But some enemies could not be fought with fire and ice. The thieves and assassins who came for the fortune were clever and patient. They did not announce themselves with armies and siege weapons. They crept in during the darkest hours of the night, using magic and stealth to bypass the defenses Claire had set up. One night, Claire was awakened by a subtle wrongness in the air. Her elven senses told her something was not right, though she could not immediately identify what had changed. She rose from her bed silently and armed herself with her sword and bow. Ember and Frost were already awake, their heads raised and their eyes scanning the darkness for threats. Claire moved through the mansion like a ghost, her bare feet making no sound on the cold floors. She checked each room methodically, looking for any sign of intrusion. Everything appeared normal until she reached the hallway that led to the main vault. There she saw a figure dressed all in black, working on the magical lock that protected the door. The thief was good, very good. He had made it past all of Claire's wards without triggering a single alarm. He was using a combination of magical tools and physical lockpicks to dismantle the vault's defenses piece by piece. In another few minutes he would have succeeded. Claire did not call out or give warning. She simply loosed an arrow that passed within an inch of the thief's ear and buried itself in the door beside his head. The thief froze, then slowly turned around with his hands raised. He was human male, perhaps 30 years old, with the lean build and quick eyes of someone who made his living through stealth and cunning. He tried to smile and make light of the situation. He claimed he was just testing the security at the request of the estate's lawyers. Claire did not believe him for a second. She kept her bow drawn with another arrow ready while she questioned him. Who had hired him? How had he gotten past the wards? Were there others with him? The thief refused to talk at first. He seemed to think he could bargain his way out of trouble, or perhaps escape if he could distract Claire long enough. But then Ember and Frost arrived, filling the hallway with their massive forms. The thief's confidence evaporated when he saw the dragons. He told Claire everything. He had been hired by a criminal organization that specialized in stealing from wealthy estates. They had spent months studying the mansion's defenses and planning this heist. The thief was just the first wave. If he succeeded in opening the vault, others were waiting nearby to help carry away the treasure. If he failed, they would know the defenses were too strong and would report back to their employers. Claire questioned the thief until she was satisfied she had learned everything useful. Then she had a decision to make. She could kill him and leave his body as a warning to others. She could turn him over to the local authorities, though she doubted they would do much to punish someone who had powerful friends. Or she could let him go with a message. She chose the third option. She told the thief to go back to his employers and tell them that the mansion was protected by forces they could not overcome. Tell them that anyone who came for the fortune would face an elven guardian and 2 dragons who never slept. Tell them that the price of failure was death, and the price of success was even worse, because Claire would hunt down everyone involved in the theft and make them pay. The thief ran from the mansion as fast as his legs could carry him. Claire watched him disappear into the darkness, then spent the rest of the night strengthening the wards he had nearly bypassed. She was troubled by how close he had come to succeeding. Her defenses were good, but they were not perfect. She needed to be smarter and more vigilant. The incident with the thief made Claire realize something important. She had been thinking of herself as a passive guardian waiting for threats to come to her. But the best defense was a good offense. She needed to take the fight to her enemies before they could organize another attack. She began using her network of informants more aggressively. Instead of just gathering information about threats, she started spreading misinformation. She planted false rumors about the mansion being cursed. She hired actors to pretend they had tried to steal from the vault and had been driven mad by magical traps. She even staged a few incidents where thieves appeared to die horribly, though in reality they were paid to leave town and never return. The tactics worked. Over the next few years, fewer people attempted to steal the fortune. The mansion gained a reputation as a place of certain death for anyone foolish enough to challenge its defenses. Some people claimed the elf guardian was actually a demon in disguise. Others said the dragons were ancient spirits of vengeance. The truth was less dramatic, but the legend served Claire's purposes well. She also began reaching out to the elven community, though she could not leave the mansion herself. She sent letters to the forest kingdoms asking for news of her family and friends. The responses were slow in coming, but when they arrived, they brought both joy and sorrow. Her mother had passed away 3 years earlier. Her sisters were married with children of their own. Her old friends barely remembered her after so many years apart. Reading those letters, Claire felt the true cost of her oath. She had given up everything to honor a promise to a dying man. She had sacrificed her connection to her people, her chance at a normal life, her hope of having a family of her own. Sometimes late at night she wondered if it had been worth it. But then she would remember Richard's kindness. She would remember Lucas's young face as he said goodbye before leaving for the academy. She would remember the oath she had made and the honor that bound her to keep it, and she would push aside her doubts and continue her vigil. 8 years after Lucas had left, Claire received a letter that filled her with both hope and anxiety. Lucas wrote that he was doing well in his studies and expected to graduate from the academy in another 6 years. He had grown tall and strong. He had made friends from all over the empire. He had learned things about trade and diplomacy that would serve him well when he returned home to claim his inheritance. But Lucas also wrote about rumors he had heard. Stories about the mansion being under constant attack. Tales about an elven warrior who had single-handedly fought off armies and criminal organizations. He was worried about Claire and asked if she needed help. He offered to send soldiers or hire mercenaries to reinforce the defenses. Claire wrote back immediately. She assured Lucas that she was fine and that the rumors were exaggerated. The mansion was secure and the fortune was safe. He should focus on his studies and not worry about home. She did not tell him about the sleepless nights or the constant state of alert she lived in. She did not mention the loneliness or the toll the years were taking on her spirit. She wanted Lucas to remember her as she had been when he left. Strong and confident and capable. She did not want him to feel guilty about the burden she carried for his sake. This was her choice and her honor. She would see it through to the end, no matter how long it took. As Claire sealed the letter and gave it to a messenger to carry across the sea, she allowed herself a moment of weakness. She wondered what Lucas looked like now after 8 years away. She wondered if he would recognize her when he finally came home. She wondered if he would think the sacrifice had been worth it. The transformation of the mansion began immediately. What had been a fortress and a tomb for 14 years started to become a home again. Lucas moved into his father's old study and spent his first week reviewing all the documents Claire had carefully maintained. He was impressed by how thorough she had been. Every transaction was recorded. Every property was accounted for. Every coin in the vaults matched the ledgers perfectly, but Lucas was not content to simply take over his father's business. He had bigger plans. He called a meeting in the great hall with Claire and the 5 elves who had traveled with him. Dawn was there along with her brother Kyle, who was an expert in elven crafts. There was also Lily, who understood herbs and medicines, Trevor, who was a skilled negotiator, and Nina, who had studied human and elven history at the academy alongside Lucas. Lucas laid out his vision in detail. The human kingdoms and the elven forests had maintained a cautious distance for centuries. There was trade between them, but it was limited and controlled by a few powerful merchants who charged outrageous prices. Most humans had never seen elven crafts. Most elves had no access to human innovations. Both sides were poorer for this separation, Lucas wanted to change that. He proposed creating a company that would facilitate real trade between the two cultures. Not just buying and selling goods, but sharing knowledge and techniques. Elven craftsmen could learn human manufacturing methods. Human engineers could study elven magic and nature-based technology. Artists from both cultures could collaborate. Scholars could exchange ideas. Claire listened to Lucas's plan with growing excitement. It was ambitious, maybe too ambitious. There would be resistance from both sides. Human merchants would see it as a threat to their profits. Elven traditionalists would view it as dangerous contact with an inferior culture. But Claire had spent 14 years fighting against people who wanted to steal and destroy. The idea of fighting for something positive and constructive appealed to her deeply. Dawn spoke up with concerns. She pointed out that trust between humans and elves was fragile. One bad incident could poison the whole enterprise. They would need to be very careful about who they worked with and how they presented themselves. Lucas agreed. That was why he wanted Claire to be the face of the company on the human side. She had lived in both worlds. She understood both cultures. And most importantly, she had a reputation for absolute integrity. Over the next few months, the mansion became a hub of activity. Lucas hired human craftsmen to build workshops on the grounds. Dawn and the other elves sent word to their communities inviting skilled workers to come and participate in the new venture. Not everyone who was invited came. Many elves were suspicious of the whole idea. But enough were curious or adventurous enough to take the risk. The first real test came when a delegation of human merchants arrived, demanding to know what Lucas was planning. These were the men who had controlled trade with the elven kingdoms for generations. They were wealthy and powerful, and they did not appreciate competition. Their leader was a man named Victor, who had done business with Richard years ago. Victor was smooth and polite on the surface, but there was steel beneath his words. He congratulated Lucas on returning home safely. He offered condolences for the loss of his father. Then he suggested that Lucas might want to consult with experienced merchants before making any rash decisions about his inheritance. Victor and his associates would be happy to provide guidance for a modest fee. Lucas declined politely. He explained that he had his own plans and his own advisors. Victor's smile became strained. He pointed out that trade with the elven kingdoms was a delicate matter. It required connections and knowledge that took years to develop. Someone as young and inexperienced as Lucas could easily make costly mistakes. Perhaps it would be wiser to sell his father's trading contracts to someone who knew what they were doing. Claire watched the exchange from her position near the door. She could see what Victor was really doing. He was trying to intimidate Lucas into giving up his plans or selling out to the established merchants. It was the same tactic that Richard's relatives had tried years ago. Apply pressure and make threats disguised as friendly advice. But Lucas did not back down. He thanked Victor for his concern, but made it clear he intended to run his own business. Victor's pleasant mask slipped. He warned Lucas that competing with the established merchants could be dangerous. Accidents happened. Shipments got lost. Warehouses caught fire. It would be unfortunate if Lucas suffered such losses because he was too proud to accept help from his elders. That was when Claire stepped forward. She did not say anything at first. She simply moved to stand beside Lucas with Ember and Frost materializing from the shadows behind her. The message was clear. Lucas was not alone, and anyone who threatened him would have to deal with an elven warrior and 2 dragons. Victor paled. He had heard the stories about the Guardian who had defended the mansion for 14 years. He had dismissed them as exaggerations. Now he realized the stories had been true. He gathered his dignity as best he could and left with his associates. But Claire knew this would not be the end of it. Victor and the other merchants would try to sabotage Lucas's venture in more subtle ways. She was right. Over the next few months, strange things began to happen. Shipments that were supposed to arrive at the mansion were delayed or sent to the wrong destinations. Workers who had been hired to help with construction suddenly quit, claiming they had been offered better jobs elsewhere. Rumors spread in town that Lucas was planning to cheat the elves or that the elves were planning to use magic to control human minds. Lucas and Claire fought back by being completely transparent. They invited local officials to tour the workshops and see exactly what was being built. They hired town criers to announce their plans publicly, so no one could claim they were hiding anything. Most importantly, they made sure their first products were of exceptional quality. The breakthrough came when Lily and a human herbalist named Katie worked together to create a new medicine. It combined elven knowledge of natural healing with human chemistry to produce something neither culture could have made alone. The medicine proved effective at treating a fever that had been sweeping through the region. Lives were saved. Parents whose children recovered from illness began to see the elven workers not as strange foreigners, but as people who had helped their families. The success of the medicine opened doors. More elves were willing to come and participate in the venture. More humans were willing to work alongside them. The workshops began producing goods that combined the best of both traditions. Elven woodcarving enhanced with human metalwork. Human textiles decorated with elven dyes that never faded. Weapons that blended human engineering with elven enchantments. Within a year, Lucas's company was thriving. Within 2 years, it had expanded to 3 other cities. Victor and the other established merchants tried to compete, but they could not match the quality and innovation of products made through genuine collaboration. Some of them eventually approached Lucas asking to form partnerships. Lucas agreed, but only on the condition that they treat elven workers as equals and share profits fairly. Claire found herself busier than she had been even during the years of defending the mansion. She traveled between cities overseeing security and resolving disputes. She trained human guards to work alongside elven scouts. She mediated conflicts between workers from different cultures. It was exhausting work, but it was also deeply fulfilling. Dawn became one of Claire's closest friends during this time. The 2 elves would sit together in the evenings talking about their experiences. Dawn was impressed by how much Claire had changed. When they first met, Claire had been worn down by years of isolation and constant vigilance. Now she was energized and engaged with life again. She smiled more. She laughed more. She seemed truly happy. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset from the mansion's terrace, Dawn asked Claire if she ever regretted making the oath that had bound her to this place for so long. Claire thought about the question carefully. She could not deny that the years had been hard. She had sacrificed much and suffered through long periods of loneliness and doubt. But looking back, she could see how everything had connected. If she had not made the oath, Lucas would have returned to find his fortune stolen and scattered. If the fortune had been lost, Lucas would not have had the resources to build his company. If the company had not been built, humans and elves might have continued to live separate lives, missing opportunities for cooperation and friendship. Claire told Dawn that she did not regret her choice. The oath had cost her dearly, but it had also given her something precious. It had given her purpose. It had tested her and proven her strength. Most importantly, it had led her to this moment, sitting on a terrace with a friend, watching the sun set over a community of humans, and elves working together in peace. As darkness fell, Claire could hear the sounds of laughter and music from the workshops below. A human carpenter was teaching an elf how to play the guitar. Elven children were playing with human children in the gardens. Workers from both cultures were sharing a meal and swapping stories. It was a small miracle, really. The kind of miracle that happened when people chose cooperation over conflict.